We've got additional leaked video specifications of the Nikon Z8, a camera that's due to be announced Wednesday, May the 10th at 8 a.m. in the morning, and I'll be covering that announcement live, starting out 1 hour before the announcement, covering the announcement, and then doing some post-game analysis. The Nikon Z8's been in development for many years. The Canon EOS R5, a camera that it's supposed to beat, came out 3 years ago. Does the Nikon finally beat that in terms of capabilities? And what about the Sony A7 R5, a camera that was announced just 6 months ago? I've got all the details coming up after this short break, but first, please do me a favor. Follow me on Twitter, but most importantly, please subscribe to this channel. Let's help me get to 40K. I'm only about 400 subscribers away. The Canon EOS R5 has a 45 megapixel sensor, while the Sony A7 R5 has a 61 megapixel sensor, and that's backside illuminated, clearly having more resolution and better low light due to that BSI sensor. But the Z8 has a 45.7 megapixel sensor edging out the Canon R5, but it's stacked. So let's do a little bit of techno babble right now. The Canon R5 is not BSI or stacked or backside illuminated or stacked. If you have a stacked sensor, it's almost always backside illuminated. So the Canon EOS R5 is going to be our baseline here. The Sony A7 R5 with a backside illuminated sensor means it should be more capable when it comes to producing images and video with less noise and of course improved dynamic range. Whereas a stacked sensor, not only can it do all the same stuff as a BSI sensor, but it can also move a whole lot more data. It can get a lot more data off the chip a whole lot quicker, and that's great for processing huge amounts of information. That's great for reducing the effects of things such as rolling shutter, which is usually unwanted. Now, a little bit of rolling shutter isn't that big of a deal, but a lot, well, it can make people a little bit nauseous. So in this case, the win goes to the Nikon Z8. Although if you're one of those people that likes to shoot high megapixel, high resolution images, then I can see you preferring the Sony A7 R5. The Canon EOS R5 has an ISO range of between 100 and 51,200, but in video it's capped at 25,600. The Sony A7 R5 has a range of between 100 and 32,000. And while the Sony A7 R5 has a limited range of between 100 and 32,000, it has an extended range of 50 to 102,400. The Nikon Z8 has an ISO range that comes in between 64,000 and 25,600. I also imagine that's the video resolution, 25,600. It's not terrific, but it's not bad. It's just for this particular segment, I would expect it to go to at least 51,200 or extend it to 102,400. But also keep in mind that this is a stacked sensor, so it should already have better low light performance, and at 25,600 should perform better than the Canon EOS R5 or the Sony A7 R5. The Canon EOS R5 is the clear winner when it comes to the number of autofocus points, with a staggering 5,940 with almost full coverage area of 90% by 100%. The Sony, on the other hand, has a coverage area between 99.7% and 74%, putting it in third place with 693 autofocus points. Whereas the Nikon Z8, it comes in last with just 493 autofocus points, but it does better than the Sony A7 R5 with increased coverage of 90 by 90%. A deep dive into this really is kind of irrelevant. The accuracy, reliability is what matters most. Then comes the number and types of subjects and objects that can be tracked, with the coverage area coming in a close third along with low light sensitivity. The Canon R5 can track people, animal, cars, and motorcycles. It has eye, face, head, and torso detection for humans, and also does some animal with eye detection as well as bird eye detection. The Sony adds planes, trains, and also does insect eye detection, whereas the Nikon Z8 tracks humans, animals, cars, trains, and planes. But again, what really matters here is not the number of points and what it can track and what it can't track, but the accuracy, the coverage area. I think this matters the most, and it's arguably Canon and Sony that have the best autofocus systems out there. And Sony, with their brand new AI chip that debuted in the Sony A7 R5, that's also coming in other cameras, well, that provides an increased edge in terms of the autofocus accuracy. And that doesn't mean that Canon's sitting down idly. The Canon R5, the R6, the R6 Mark II, and all the cameras that have come out since the R5, while they don't have a dedicated AI chip, they do have artificial intelligence, which does improve the accuracy. However, if I'm shooting a bunch of subjects, such as my son doing karate, it'll lock onto his eyes, no problem, but then if a hand comes in front of his face, it goes on to the next person. And to be able to have the eye autofocus, stuck or sticky onto a particular subject would certainly improve Canon. But when it comes to the Nikon Z8, I still think it needs to improve its autofocus system. The Nikon Z9 has a pretty good autofocus system, but there are times where it misses far more than, well, Canon or Sony. I think in this case, I'm going to have to give the win not to the Nikon Z8 or the Canon R5, but to the Sony, the A7 R5 with their improved autofocus system, the ability to track everything except for, well, UFOs and boats, and to have that dedicated AI chip. I'm really impressed with what Sony's doing in their cameras, but I wouldn't be surprised if Canon also comes out with a dedicated AI chip. Will the Nikon Z8 have some sort of dedicated AI chip? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. The Canon R5 performs well from -6 to 20 EV, but the Sony A7 R5 only manages -4.5 to 20 EV. But the Nikon Z8 is rumored to come in at -7 to 19 EV. And what the numbers are saying here is that the Nikon Z8 is more sensitive in low light situations, and, well, again, this makes sense due to that stacked sensor. The Canon EOS R5 is no slouch here, but the win, well, it clearly goes to the Nikon Z8. And again, this is assuming, as it is with everything I'm talking about in this video, that the leaked specifications that we're getting, that Nikon Rumors is presenting to us from sources, well, that they're accurate. But we're just a few days away from finding out. On Wednesday, we'll know for sure. And don't forget, at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm doing my live stream, and we're going to talk about the Nikon Z8, the latest leaked specifications, and what we would do with my panel if we were the president of Nikon. And then at 8 o'clock, we'll cover the announcement live. We'll cover the event live. And then as soon as it's over, I'll have some special guests that will talk about this camera. And hopefully I'll have some guests at that point, I'm really working hard on this, that have hands-on of this camera. So we'll just have to wait and see. So that's coming up in just a few days now. Well, not just a few days, I guess 3 or 4 days. Seems like just a few days, doesn't it? We've been waiting for so many years. The Canon EOS R5 shoots 20 frames per second electronic and 12 frames per second mechanical, while the Sony's limited to 10 frames per second, though it is at 61 megapixels. But I think what's holding back the Sony here is the Type A CF Express card. The Nikon Z8, it can shoot right up there with the Canon at 20 frames per second, but it is far faster, shooting 120 frames per second when shooting at lower resolutions such as 11 megapixels. So both the Canon and the Sony shoot at around 1.2 gigabytes per second when shooting 20 frames per second lossless RAW at 45 megapixels. But what gives the Nikon Z8 the win here is the ability to shoot at much faster. Now we can shoot at 45 frames per second and then in post shrink them down for social media purpose to something like 11 megapixels. But to be able to shoot at 120 frames per second at 11 megapixels, that's a big deal. That's a huge deal. That really is impressive. And so that's why the Nikon Z8 gets the win here. And I have no doubt that this capability is going to come across because we can see it's already in the Nikon Z9. And I think that's something of interest here. A lot of what we're seeing as the rumored specifications for the Nikon Z8 are already in the Nikon Z9. And some people are a little bit, well, peeved by that. And they just don't believe it. Why would Nikon take the Nikon Z9 and take the bulk of the capabilities, put them in the Z8 with a few extra ones? Well, why would anybody buy the Z9? Well, and there's a few very good reasons for that. The Nikon Z8, try that again, the Nikon Z9 is what we refer to as being on the bleeding edge. If you want the fastest possible performance, the fastest or the best possible quality, well, you're going to get that with the Nikon Z9. The ability to shoot with dual CF Express Type B cards, well, you can't do that on the Canon EOS R5. You can't do that on the Nikon Z8. And Sony, with its Type A cards, with only a single PCIe lane, well, you're really limited in how fast you can shoot. You're limited in how the type of video resolutions and refresh rates that you can shoot at. Not only that, the Nikon Z9 has a bigger battery, and yes, you can swap in batteries when you're shooting with the Nikon Z8, but if you're shooting the Olympics or sports where you don't want to be switching out batteries, because while you're switching out that battery, and yes, you can probably do it pretty quickly, you're missing out on what's going on the field. So a bigger battery with more capacity matters. Dual CF Express Type B cards matters. And a few of these other capabilities make the Z9 for an extra, what, $1,000 to $1,500 a much better option. So for you and I that look at the Nikon Z9 and the Nikon Z8 and say, well, clearly for $1,000 or $1,500 less, why wouldn't I get the Nikon Z8? Well, that's because it's aimed at us. But for professionals, those shooting for the cover of a magazine, you want to be accurate. You want to be as accurate as you can most of the time. And for them, they look at the Nikon Z9 and say, yeah, you know what? I'm not willing to save $1,500 or $1,000 and risk not getting the shot. I need the best of the best because I am the best of the best. Both R5s have a max shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second, while the Nikon Z8 has a max shutter speed of 1/32,000th of a second. Yeah, and I hear you, 1/8,000th of a second works most of the times, and well, it kind of has to because that's what I have in the Canon EOS R5. But to be able to push, to have the extra room, 1/32,000th of a second, that's nice to have. I really appreciate that. And so obviously, once again, the Nikon Z8 gets the win. The Canon EOS R5 shoots 8K video at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, but it does so while shooting RAW. It does have other codecs, but this far exceeds what Sony can do at just 24 and 25 frames per second, and it doesn't do RAW, and it does 8K 24 and 25 with a 1.2 times crop. The Nikon Z8 is clearly the winner here, as it can do 8.3K, 24, 25, 30 frames per second, all the basic frame rates, as well as 50 and 60 frames per second in Nikon RAW. However, like any sort of specifications, and when you're comparing one camera to another, well, there are some caveats here. Now, the Canon EOS R5, while it's limited to 8K at 30 frames per second, I'm sorry, I'm just realizing what I'm saying here and how ridiculous this sounds. While the Canon EOS R5 just shoots at 8K 30. Doesn't that just sound actually crazy rolling off the tongue? Anyhow, the Nikon Z8 can shoot 8K at up to 60 frames per second, but here's the thing. While it can do RAW, it can't do DCI and UHD. In fact, the Canon R5 is the only camera that we're looking at here that can actually shoot both DCI and UHD. So it's a whole lot harder to say which one's the better camera here. Do you need DCI? Well, then the Canon R5 is the better camera for you. But what about 8K? Are you happy with 24, 25, and 30 frames per second? Or do you need 50 and 60? Well, then in that case, you want to go with the Nikon. And what about Apple ProRes? Do you really want that? Well, then you're going to have to go with the Nikon. But at this point, we don't know if Apple ProRes works outside of 4K, because in the Nikon Z9, while you do have Apple ProRes, it's just limited to 4K. And speaking of 4K, we now have some additional leaked specifications of what the Nikon Z8 can do, again thanks to Nikon rumors. We all know that the Canon EOS R5 can shoot 4K all the way up to 120 frames per second, while the Sony, surprisingly at the same price, is limited to 4K at 60 frames per second. But the Nikon Z8, just like the Canon R5, can shoot 4K up to 120 frames per second, but again, that's UHD, whereas the Canon R5 can shoot both UHD and DCI in 4K. But if these specs are accurate, well then, in my view, the winner goes to the Canon EOS R5. Now, while the Nikon can also do 4K 120, it only does UHD. The Canon R5 can do both DCI and UHD, and while I personally don't shoot DCI, it's nice to know that it's there if I'm going to be shooting some commercial applications that need DCI. I mean, you can always crop in, right? But you can't create data where there isn't data. So in this case, the winning goes to the Canon EOS R5, a 3-year-old camera. All three cameras have a 3.2-inch flip screen, but the Sony has that 4-axis tilting flip screen. Now, while the Z8 does have a 4-axis tilt screen, we don't know exactly how it functions. Does it pull out the same way as the Sony? Does it give us that flip screen as well? I really love how the Sony's engineered, and the only reason I'm giving the win here to the Sony is just because I don't have enough information on the Nikon Z8. Well, actually, that's not completely true. It's that we've received so many leaked images on the Nikon Z8, and they've clearly all been doctored, that I'm not willing to give the win to a camera that we just have leaked specifications and we can't even get a proper leaked video, which should be able to tell us what type of tilt flip screen this camera has. Each camera's EVF can do 120 frames per second. The Sony, well, it gets the win with 9.44 million dots. The Canon EOS R5, 5.69 million dots. And the Nikon Z8 comes in at last with just 3.69 million dots, the same as what's found in the Nikon Z9. But now I want to talk to you about the storage. The Canon EOS R5, along with the Nikon Z8, come with just one CF Express Type B card, with the other card slot, so it is dual card slots, is a UHS 2 card slot, and that means it can put in, well, it can support a V60 and a V90 card. But that's a little bit frustrating for some. Why does it just have a UHS 2 card slot as the second slot? The Sony, the A7R5, many say, is a smarter camera because it has dual card slots, but you can take a CF Express Type A card and put it in both card slots, giving you faster speeds than you can get with a UHS 2 card slot. And they're right. But the win doesn't go to the Sony because of, well, the limitation of that architecture. You see, CF Express Type A cards have a single PCIe lane. Type B cards have 2 PCIe lanes and twice the storage. And Type C cards, well, they're not on the market right now, and I'm quoting you all Gen 3. So CF Express Type B cards are twice the capacity, and of course twice the speed, and this does scale. So the Canon EOS R5, if it wants to shoot 20 frames per second lossless RAW, it can do so at 1.2 gigabytes per second and get all that glorious detail. And that's why the Sony a7 R5, despite having 61 megapixels, is limited to just 10 frames per second, or other Sony cameras, why they're limited to just 10 frames per second. Because when you're shooting high speed, high resolution, you're going to hit that wall, and that wall is about 650 megabytes per second. That's the maximum sustained write speed, and that's the latest Angelbird 1 terabyte card. The fastest sustained write speed it can go throughout the entire card, whether it's full or empty. You hold down that shutter button, it's going to max out at, well, just 650 megabytes per second. It's the maximum sustained write speed that you want to pay attention to. Now take a look at Angelbird's 1 terabyte CF Express Type B card, the AV Pro Mark II. Well, it's got a high speed of 1.4 gigabytes per second, 1.45 gigabytes per second. That's significantly faster than 650 megabytes per second. So you can now shoot at 45 megapixels, 20 frames per second lossless RAW, and you're going to have no problem at 1.2 gigabytes per second. And even Angelbird's slower 1 terabyte card with 1.3 gigabytes per second can easily handle that speed. And when it comes to video, being able to shoot 8K 60 RAW, that is a limitation on the Sony that it's just going to have a hard time doing. Now, the Canon EOS R5 can shoot 8K 30 RAW at around 325 gigabytes per second. So we could likely double that and get around 650, which means that it might be possible to shoot 8K 60 RAW on a Sony camera, but you're coming up right up against that speed limit of 650 megabytes per second. And yes, they can come out with codecs to kind of work around that, but you can see that the Type A cards, they have this speed limitation, and I think it's going to force Sony at someday to just say, you know what, we got to move away from Type A cards to Type B cards, at least with the current, well, at least with the professional level cameras, because they just produced this camera, the Sony a7 R5, in October. It's only been out for 6 months. And a 3-year-old camera, the Canon EOS R5, can shoot a whole lot faster. And a new camera from Nikon, the Nikon Z8, it can shoot faster as well. Now it comes to HDMI out, and all cameras here can do HDMI out. The Sony takes the win with 16-bit RAW, but that is 4K only. The Canon R5 can output RAW, but it can also output 10-bit and 12-bit, and the Z8 caps out at 10-bit. 16-bit RAW, that's a big deal. That's a huge deal, and the Sony a7 R5, well, it gets the win just for that. And even though it's only 4K only, I love the Canon EOS R5 with Canon Log 3. I can shoot 10-bit or 12-bit, and that's really impressive. But to be able to get 16-bit RAW, I hope the Canon EOS R5 Mark II gets 16-bit RAW. And the Nikon Z8, since it hasn't been announced yet, there's always a chance that it could have 16-bit RAW as well. I really hope it does, but based on what I'm seeing here, well, I have to give the win to the Sony a7 R5. Sadly, we don't know anything about the price of the Nikon Z8. And if you've been following this channel for the past couple of weeks, you'll see several videos coming out with leaked pricing, and each one has been faked. In fact, the images are low resolution with the photo of the camera on these leaked specifications showing clear signs of editing. And at that point, well, we have to dismiss the pricing. And if we go back to this slide from Nikon Rumors, that question mark tells you everything. Not even Nikon Rumors believes that the pricing information that we've seen on the Z8 is reliable. But let's take a look at the price of the Canon EOS R5. This camera today, again, remember, it is a 3-year-old camera. It's discounted down to $33.99. That's right, its regular price is $38.99. It's currently on sale for $33.99. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, Simon, it's just on sale right now. It'll go back up to its regular price. No, it won't. You see, the Canon R5 has been on a permanent sale since Black Friday of last year, going on sale for $200 off, then $400 off, and now $500 off, but there's more. As you can see here, this is from Adorama. The Canon EOS R5 is on sale for $33.99, but you also get, thrown in for free, the battery grip worth $350. And that brings the price down to around $3,049 if you need the battery grip. If you don't need it, well, then you can easily flip that battery grip on Kijiji, eBay, or any other site and easily get $200 for it, dropping your price down to, well, at least $31.99, and that's a big deal. The Sony a7R5, well, it was just released, well, it was announced back in November of last year and released shortly thereafter at $38.98, so I don't expect that one to go on sale. Now, the price of the Nikon Z9, we do have some forecasts. Now, assuming that it doesn't have a stacked sensor, and I'm not saying I have any information for that, but assuming it doesn't have a stacked sensor, then I believe the price of the Nikon Z8 can be between somewhere around $34.99 to $39.99. And yes, you can take a look at that Canon EOS R5 to see that, but if it does have a stacked sensor, and it's certainly plausible, it could have that, but that helps them get a much higher price at around $38.99 on the low end to $42.99. A stacked sensor would be huge. It gives this camera so many more, well, advantages and capabilities over the Canon EOS R5 and the Sony a7R5. It improves low light performance. It improves the ability to get information off the chip a whole lot quicker. And things such as rolling shutter, improved. Low light performance, improved. Dynamic range, improved. Status symbol of holding a Nikon Z8, improved. In terms of many capabilities, it looks like the Nikon Z8 is the clear winner. Again, these are leaked specifications, we don't know how accurate they are, of a camera that's supposed to be announced in just a couple of days. And when we do have that announcement, we'll get reviews, people showing us hands-on what this camera is going to be like. And I can guarantee you it's going to be a day filled of people showing off the camera, reviewing the camera, videographers, photographers, telling us why this is the best camera out there. And while they're not going to say it's better than the Canon EOS R5, you can guarantee that all the scenarios they're going to choose are the same scenarios that are chosen for the Canon EOS R5. I mean, just look at the video, 8K 60 frames per second or 8.3K Nikon RAW. That's pretty impressive. Stacked sensor should mean better resolution, 8K oversample 4K, 4K 120 frames per second. The Sony, again, caps out at 60 frames per second. Stills, 20 frames per second lossless RAW, CF Express Type B. It's proving out to be a pretty impressive camera, and that stacked sensor would give it a definite edge over the Canon EOS R5 and would have many people kind of flocking to the Nikon Z8. I'm really impressed with this camera. I'm really looking forward to it. But again, I want to know in the comment section, I want you to rank these three cameras from best to worst. And even the worst camera, I can't imagine it's a terrible camera. They're all really good cameras, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get an idea from you watching this channel, Steve, Kathy, John. What do you think? What are your thoughts? How different are my expectations of the Nikon Z8 compared to the R5 and the A7R5? I'd really like to know what your number one, number two, and number three are. And if you want to stay up to date on everything Nikon Z8 or even the Canon EOS R5 firmware update, which we're expecting to get after the Nikon Z8 announcement, I'm not saying right away and on the same day, but I can bet you anything, Canon's watching this, they've already got some leaked information, they're probably using their special sources that found information, so I bet you anything, Canon's preparing some sort of firmware update to the Canon EOS R5, and based on what we see in this camera, the date for the Canon EOS R5 Mark II might be coming out a little bit sooner. So if you want to stay up to date on all the major camera news and rumors, go ahead and subscribe, but make sure you choose all notifications. And for all the minor news and rumors, such as, well, pricing information on the Nikon Z6 Mark III, the Canon EOS R5, or all the minor news and rumors that aren't quite big enough to have their own separate video, like the Canon RF 500mm, well, then follow me on Twitter because I tweet these out several times a day. And if you want to pre-order the Nikon Z8, well, then use my smart links here. They're not working right now, but what happens with these smart links is as soon as the Nikon Z8 is announced, once the embargo's lifted, this smart link will work. And it won't just list you the body alone, it'll list you any sort of SKU that has the Nikon Z8 in it. So body alone, body with kit lenses, or anything else, or special packages. So go ahead and copy the smart link for the pre-order for the Nikon Z8, because on Wednesday, the 10th at 8 a.m. in the morning or shortly thereafter, these links will be working and you'll be able to pre-order the camera. I suspect, based on, I've already reached out to some local camera stores and they've told me that the number of people at their store that have said, I want the Nikon Z8, put me on your list, even though there's no pre-order list, and this is the magic of a small local camera store, even though there isn't any sort of pre-order set up right now, these stores are taking names and they're saying that there's a huge demand for the Nikon Z8. So if you're interested in pre-ordering, my recommendation is go ahead and pre-order, use these links, pre-order as soon as it's available, then watch all the reviews, watch everything, and if you kind of get second thoughts and you realize you don't want it, well, you can cancel your pre-order, but at least you hold your place in line. We saw this with the Canon EOS R5, another camera that sold very, very well. Some people had to wait a year to 18 months to get the camera. That was an awful long time. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a great weekend. We'll see you again soon. And don't forget, on Wednesday, May the 10th at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to be doing a live stream, full coverage of the Nikon Z8. We're going to take a look at the latest leaked specifications, any leaked photos that we've got, anything that comes in overnight, and then we'll cover the announcement live. And I'm going to have a panel, and I'm working very hard to see if we can't get some people who have the Nikon Z8 in their hands to be able to come on the channel right after the embargo's lifted. So sometime after, probably a few minutes after Nikon does their presentation, the embargo will be lifted, and I should have some guests coming on at that point. So I'm super excited. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for subscribing. We'll see you again soon.